Jake had always dreamed of owning a lake cabin somewhere quiet to escape the noise of the city and recharge on weekends. When he finally found a small rustic cabin nestled on the edge of Lake Pinewood, just beyond the limits of the nearby neighborhood, he felt he'd hit the jackpot. The cabin was peaceful, surrounded by tall pines and open water views. And he couldn't wait to spend summers and weekends there. At first, everything was perfect. Mornings began with coffee on the porch as mist rose from the lake. Afternoons were filled with fishing and long hikes. Evenings came with a crackling fire pit under the stars. It was his sanctuary. But that calm was shattered one Saturday afternoon when there was an unexpected knock on the door. Jake opened it to find two local police officers standing on the porch. "Good afternoon, sir," one officer said politely. "We're just checking in on a complaint that came in about some disturbance." Jake blinked in surprise. "Disturbance? I haven't heard anything. I've been here all weekend." The officers explained that someone had reported loud noises coming from the cabin late the previous night. Jake was certain there had been no parties or anything unusual, just the gentle sounds of nature and the occasional music playing quietly. They asked a few questions, made some notes, and left with a friendly reminder to keep the volume down. Jake thought little of it, maybe a neighbor's misunderstanding or a mistake, but over the next few weeks, the police returned again and again. Each time, Jake would be asked similar questions about noise complaints or suspicious activity. Each time he politely explained that he was alone, keeping to himself, and that his property was private. The visits began to feel less like routine checks and more like unwelcome interruptions. Jake started to feel frustrated, wondering why. The officers were called so often. Was someone deliberately targeting him? And why? What puzzled Jake even more was that the cabin was located outside of the nearby homeowner association's official boundaries. He wasn't a member of that association and had never signed any agreements or rules connected to them. So, why was the HOA involved in making calls to the police about his property? Jake decided to reach out directly to the HOA's board to find out what was going on. He sent emails and made phone calls, explaining who he was and asking politely for information about the complaints. The responses were vague and unhelpful. A board member mentioned concerns about the property, but refused to give specifics. Another said the association had a responsibility to maintain peace and order in the surrounding area. Jake's frustration grew. He wasn't sure if the HOA was acting on false complaints or trying to exert power where they had none. Each call to the police felt like an unnecessary intrusion into his peaceful retreat at night. Jake found himself lying awake, wondering what his next steps should be. He had invested time, money, and hope into this cabin. He had every right to enjoy it peacefully without constant interruptions or suspicion. Determined to protect his property and his peace of mind, Jake knew he needed to take action. The next time the police arrived, he planned to ask even more questions, if necessary, seek legal advice. For now, he watched the calm lake surface, longing for the quiet weekend he had imagined when he first bought the cabin. He wasn't going to let unexpected police visits ruin his dream. After his fifth unexpected visit from the police, Jake's patience was running thin. The calm he had hoped for in his lake cabin was being replaced by frustration and a growing sense of being watched. Something didn't add up, and he was determined to find out exactly what. The next day, Jake took a deep breath and picked up his phone. He started by calling the local HOA office not to argue, but to get some clarity. He explained who he was, where his cabin was located, and asked for any information about complaints involving his property. The person who answered was polite but guarded. "Sir, the association has received multiple concerns about activity around your cabin," she said vaguely. "We're responsible for keeping the neighborhood peaceful." Jake frowned. "I understand, but I'm not part of the association. My property is outside your boundaries. I've never signed any agreements, and I'm not sure why you're involved." There was a pause on the line. "Our members have noticed things they feel are out of place," she replied carefully. It's important that everyone respects community standards." Jake thanked her but left the call feeling more confused than ever. What exactly were the concerns? Who was making these reports? And how did the HOA have any authority over his property at all? Next, he decided to attend the upcoming HOA board meeting. Maybe face-to-face conversations would shed some light. The meeting was held in a modest room at the neighborhood clubhouse. Jake sat quietly in the back, listening as the board discussed various matters: maintenance, upcoming events, landscaping rules. When it was his turn to speak, he introduced himself as a cabin owner outside the association who had been receiving repeated police visits. "I'm here to understand why my property has become the subject of so many complaints," Jake said clearly. "I've done nothing to disrupt the neighborhood, and I'm not a member of this association. I would appreciate an explanation." The board members exchanged glances. One woman cleared her throat. "We've had reports from residents about noise and unauthorized use of certain amenities near the lake," she said carefully. "It's our responsibility to address those concerns." Jake shook his head. "I'm not using any HOA amenities. My property line is clearly outside the association's jurisdiction. I want to be clear that these complaints are unfounded." Some residents in the room murmured quietly, while others looked uncomfortable. A board member then suggested that the confusion might stem from the proximity of Jake's cabin to the neighborhood, and the fact that some residents thought that property was part of the HOA. Jake knew this was an excuse. "If there are issues, I'm happy to talk and work towards a solution," he said. "But this repeated involvement of police is unnecessary and disruptive. I want to resolve this respectfully." The meeting ended with promises to look into the situation, but Jake left feeling like the association was unwilling to take real responsibility. Back at his cabin, he reflected on the situation. It was clear that the HOA had influence over its members and that some residents were likely behind the complaints. But Jake's property rights needed to be respected. He started organizing his thoughts. If the HOA didn't have legal authority over his cabin, then repeatedly involving law enforcement without cause could be considered harassment. He took out his phone and began recording notes about each police visit, dates, times, officers' names, and the nature of the complaints. He even gathered photos of his property line and official maps showing his location outside the HOA boundaries. Jake realized he needed professional help. This wasn't just a neighborhood squabble anymore. It had become a serious matter involving legal rights and property protections. With resolve, Jake searched for attorneys experienced in property law and HOA disputes. After a few calls, he scheduled a meeting with one of the top recommended lawyers in the county. That night, Jake stood on his cabin porch, looking out over the calm lake. The water shimmered under the moonlight, and for a moment, he allowed himself to believe that he could reclaim his peaceful retreat, but first, he had to stand up and fight for it. The steady rhythm of the lake, once a balm to Jake's city-worn nerves, now seemed overshadowed by the looming tension that followed every police visit. Each unexpected knock on the door chipped away at the peace he had worked so hard to build. And with every inquiry, Jake's sense of being watched and judged grew stronger. Word had begun to spread among the nearby residents. Some nodded politely as they passed by, but others whispered behind their hands. At the local store, Jake overheard fragments of conversations, mentions of that cabin out by the lake, and speculation about what was really going on. Despite his efforts to remain calm and cooperative, the constant scrutiny started to wear on him. What was once a place to unwind felt more like a spotlight, where every movement was monitored. Jake decided it was time to be proactive. He pulled together all the notes from his previous police encounters, the dates, times, names of officers, and the exact complaints filed. He reviewed maps and documents that proved his cabin was clearly outside the HOA boundaries. He even took photos showing the distance between his property and the nearest HOA marker. With a growing sense of determination, Jake reached out to neighbors outside the HOA, seeking support and confirmation. Many sympathized with his situation, agreeing that repeated police visits without clear cause were unusual and unfair. One afternoon, while fixing a fence post near the cabin, Jake was approached by a man from the nearby neighborhood. The man introduced himself as Tom, longtime resident and quiet observer of the situation. "I've seen those police visits myself," Tom said quietly. "It's more than just noise complaints. Some folks don't want outsiders here." Jake frowned. "I'm not trying to cause problems. I just want to enjoy my property without all this hassle." Tom nodded. "I get it. It's hard when a group tries to control everything, but you're not alone. Some of us think the repeated calls are over the top." That small gesture of solidarity meant more to Jake than Tom might have realized. It was a reminder that the truth had allies, even if they were quiet for now. Meanwhile, the police visits didn't stop. One evening, Jake was sitting by the fire pit when flashing lights illuminated the driveway. Two officers approached, again responding to a new complaint. Jake calmly answered their questions, noting the officers' names and their careful but polite demeanor. "I'm not sure why this keeps happening," Jake said. "I want to cooperate, but it feels like there's nothing to complain about." The officers exchanged looks. "We're just following up on reports," one said. "If you believe this is harassment, you should tell your lawyer." That advice echoed in Jake's mind. Back inside the cabin, Jake spent hours researching local laws and HOA authority limits. He discovered that while HOAs have certain powers over members, they do not extend to properties outside their official boundaries. And repeatedly calling the police without cause could be seen as harassment. With this knowledge, Jake began drafting a plan. He would continue documenting everything. He would gather witnesses. And he would prepare to stand up for his rights legally if necessary. That night, as the lake's surface reflected the moonlight, Jake felt a renewed sense of purpose. The peaceful retreat he dreamed of was still possible, but he had to fight. For it, the battle wasn't just about a cabin anymore. It was about standing firm against unnecessary interference, about respect for boundaries, and about claiming the right to quiet enjoyment. Jake wasn't backing down. Jake sat at the small kitchen table inside his lake cabin, a stack of documents spread before him. Police reports, maps showing property lines, notes from his encounters, and printed HOA guidelines, all carefully reviewed and organized. The growing pile was a testament to the frustrating journey he had been on, one that was far from over. After days of researching on his own, Jake knew it was time to seek professional advice. The repeated police visits and vague HOA complaints were more than just annoying. They raised serious questions about his rights as a property owner. He picked up his phone and called a local law firm specializing in property and association law. The receptionist scheduled a meeting with attorney Karen Mitchell, who came highly recommended for her experience in navigating disputes between homeowners and associations. A few days later, Jake walked into her office, feeling a mix of hope and apprehension. Karen greeted him warmly and invited him to sit. "Tell me everything," she said as Jake laid out the timeline and shared his documentation. Karen listened carefully, nodding as Jake described the repeated police visits and the HOA's involvement. Despite his cabin being outside their jurisdiction, this isn't uncommon, she explained once he finished. HOAs have certain rights over their members, but their authority stops at the property lines. If your cabin is outside those boundaries, the association doesn't have the power to regulate your property or involve the police in this way. Jake felt a spark of relief. "So, what can I do?" "We need to be strategic," Karen said. "First, we'll gather all your documentation and build a clear case showing the pattern of harassment through repeated police calls. The goal will be to put a stop to these unwarranted visits and protect your right to enjoy your property peacefully." Jake leaned in. "Could this go to court?" "It's a possibility," Karen replied. "But sometimes a well-prepared legal notice can persuade the association to back off before things escalate. We'll consider all options." As they talked, Karen explained how the law balanced HOA powers with individual property rights. She emphasized that a key factor was proving the HOA's actions were without legitimate cause and caused unnecessary disruption. Jake appreciated her calm, straightforward approach. It gave him confidence that he wasn't just fighting an uphill battle alone. After the meeting, Jake felt more prepared than ever. He returned to the cabin and immediately began compiling everything Karen suggested: detailed logs of police visits, copies of property deeds, maps showing HOA boundaries, and statements from neighbors who had witnessed the situation. He also started drafting a timeline of events, highlighting the increasing frequency of calls and the lack of real complaints. Meanwhile, Karen promised to review HOA bylaws and local ordinances to identify any weaknesses in their approach. Over the next few days, Jake and Karen exchanged emails and phone calls, planning the next steps carefully. They discussed sending a formal letter to the HOA, warning them against further interference and outlining possible legal consequences if the harassment continued. Jake realized this was about more than just stopping police visits. It was about standing up for his rights and setting a clear boundary. One evening, Jake sat on the porch watching the sun set over the lake. The water glowed golden, and a gentle breeze rustled the pine needles overhead. For the first time in weeks, he felt a quiet strength growing inside him. He wasn't just a cabin owner anymore. He was someone ready to protect what was his. And with Karen by his side, he was ready to take on whatever came next. Jake's cabin, once a serene escape from the busy world, had now become the center of an unfolding legal battle. But rather than feeling defeated by the repeated police visits and vague HOA complaints, Jake found a new sense of purpose. He was determined to build a strong case, one that would clearly show the unwarranted interference he had endured over the next few weeks. Jake worked closely with attorney Karen Mitchell, methodically gathering every piece of information that could support their claim. Each police visit was recorded in meticulous detail: dates, times, names of officers, the exact nature of the complaints, and the outcomes of their conversations. Jake even went back and requested copies of police reports related to the calls. "It's important to have a clear record," Karen explained during one meeting. "This kind of documentation helps show a pattern, not just isolated incidents." Jake also compiled property documents. Official maps and surveys confirmed beyond doubt that his cabin was outside the HOA boundaries. He obtained copies of the HOA's bylaws and rules, carefully noting any language that could be misinterpreted or overstepped when applied to his property. With Karen's guidance, Dre reached out to neighbors who lived near the HOA border. Some were hesitant at first, wary of stirring up trouble, but a few stepped forward. They shared their observations of the police visits and their impressions of the HOA's involvement. One neighbor, a longtime resident named Martha, provided a written statement. She recounted how she had never heard loud noise from Jake's cabin and described the police visits as disruptive and unnecessary. Her support added a personal and credible voice to Jake's growing case. Jake even started to gather evidence of his daily routine at the cabin. Photos and videos showed that his visits were low-key, quiet evenings by the fire, simple fishing trips, and peaceful walks along the lake. He wanted to paint an honest picture of his lifestyle, countering any vague accusations of disturbances. Meanwhile, Karen dug into legal precedents, reviewing past cases where property owners had faced similar harassment from homeowners associations. She identified key arguments that could protect Jake's rights and limit the HOA's reach. "We need to show the court that the HOA's actions weren't just mistaken, they were improper," Karen told Jake, repeatedly involving the police without cause crosses a line. As the evidence mounted, Jake felt a growing confidence. What once felt like an uphill battle now looked like a fight he could win. But they both knew that gathering evidence was just one step. The next phase, bringing the case before the court, would be the real challenge. One evening, After a long day organizing documents, Jake sat outside his cabin, the lake calm under a setting sun. The peaceful scene reminded him why this fight mattered so much. This was his sanctuary. His right to enjoy it without interference was worth standing up for. With Karen's support, Jake was ready to take the next step and make his case heard. The morning of the court hearing arrived with a chill in the air. The lake cabin, a distant memory behind Jake as he walked into the courthouse with his attorney, Karen Mitchell. The weight of weeks of preparation rested on his shoulders, but so did a quiet confidence. Jake took a deep breath. Today wasn't just about him. It was about his right to enjoy his property in peace and standing up against repeated disruptions without cause. The courtroom was modest but formal, filled with quiet murmurs and the low shuffle of papers. Oh my God. Judge, an experienced and fair-minded woman, reviewed the case files as the session began. Karen began with a clear, calm presentation of the facts. She laid out the timeline of repeated police visits, emphasizing that every complaint originated from the Homeowners Association, despite Jake's property lying clearly outside its jurisdiction. The association's actions, Karen argued, have caused unnecessary stress and disruption to Mr. Thompson, who has done nothing to warrant police involvement. She presented the evidence meticulously. Police reports, HOA bylaws, property maps, and neighbor statements. Each document painted a consistent picture of unwarranted interference. Jake felt the tension ease slightly as Karen spoke. She was confident, precise, and unwavering when the HOA representatives took the floor. Their defense centered on concerns about neighborhood peace and safety. They argued that the calls were made in good faith, based on resident complaints about disturbances. But Karen was ready. She pointed out that the HOA's jurisdiction did not extend to Jake's cabin, and that repeated calls without substantiated cause overstepped their authority. The law is clear, she stated firmly. Property rights must be respected. Unfounded harassment is unacceptable. Witnesses for both sides were called. Jake's neighbors testified to the peaceful nature of his visits. HOA members offered vague references to community concerns, but struggled to present concrete evidence. Throughout, Jake remained composed, answering questions honestly and calmly. The courtroom atmosphere grew less tense, and a sense of fairness began to emerge. After several hours of testimony and legal arguments, the judge thanked both parties and adjourned the session, promising a careful review before ruling. Outside the courthouse, Jake and Karen exchanged a glance. The hard part was over now. It was up to the court. News of the case had begun to circulate locally, drawing interest from residents curious about the outcome. Jake was reminded why he had fought so hard. This wasn't just about a cabin or an HOA, it was about standing up for fairness and clear boundaries. That evening, Jake returned to his lakeside retreat. The water was calm, the stars beginning to shine overhead. For the first time in weeks, he felt hope. No matter the outcome, he had taken a stand. Weeks passed with a steady rhythm of waiting. Each day, Jake found himself returning to his cabin's porch, staring out across the calm lake, wondering how the judge would rule. The stress that had gripped him during the repeated police visits had faded into a quiet determination to see justice done. Finally, the court's decision arrived. Jake met with attorney Karen Mitchell in her office to review the ruling. The judge's written opinion was clear and decisive. The Homeowners Association had overstepped its authority by repeatedly involving law enforcement without legitimate cause, especially given that Jake's cabin was outside the HOA's jurisdiction. The court ordered the HOA to cease all unwarranted complaints and visits related to Jake's property. More importantly, the HOA was held responsible for the costs Jake had incurred during the legal process. Jake felt a rush of relief and vindication. All the documentation, the witness statements, and the steady support had paid off. It wasn't just defending his cabin, he was affirming the fundamental rights of property owners everywhere. Word spread quickly through the neighboring areas. Some residents expressed surprise. Others admitted they hadn't known the full story. For Jake, It was less about winning approval and more about reclaiming his peaceful retreat. That weekend, Jake invited a few close neighbors, including Martha and Tom, to his cabin for a small celebration. The air was filled with laughter, the crackling fire, and the fresh scent of pine. This feels like the first real moment of peace in months, Jake said, raising his cup in a quiet toast. Martha smiled. You stood up for what's right. That matters. But Jake also took the time to reflect on the experience. The ordeal had been stressful and exhausting, but it had taught him valuable lessons about standing firm, documenting carefully, and seeking help when needed. He realized that boundaries, both physical and legal, needed to be respected, and that sometimes standing up was the only way to ensure that happened. Back at the cabin, as the sun set over the lake, Jake felt a deep sense of contentment. The water reflected golden hues, the trees whispered in the breeze, and the cabin, his sanctuary, was finally safe from interference. Though the fight had been hard, Jake knew it had been worth every moment. He was home, with the court ruling behind him. Jake finally felt a heavy cloud of tension lift from his shoulders. The repeated police visits that had once shattered his peace were now just memories, lessons, etched deeply but no longer defining his time at the lake cabin. Sitting on his porch, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the water, Jake took a moment to reflect. The cabin, his retreat, had survived not only the harsh winters and storms, but also an unexpected battle over something as fundamental as the right to enjoy his own property. The victory was more than legal. It was personal. Standing up to the HOA had demanded courage, patience, and meticulous preparation. He had learned how to document thoroughly, seek out allies, and navigate the complexities of local laws. Most importantly, he had discovered that peace required sometimes fighting for boundaries. The neighbors who had supported him, like Martha and Tom, became more than acquaintances. They symbolized a sense of community that went beyond bylaws and meetings, a shared respect for fairness and quiet living. Jake looked forward to spending more time with them, perhaps even lending a hand in local projects or simple gatherings. By the lake, with the HOA's interference officially curtailed, Jake felt free to rebuild the rituals that had once made the cabin special. Quiet mornings, watching the sunrise, afternoons fishing on the lake, evenings around the fire pit without the lingering tension of unwelcome interruptions. He also took time to update his property documentation, ensuring everything was in order to prevent future confusion. With Karen Mitchell's help, he set up clear communication channels with local authorities, making sure that any future concerns could be handled quickly and fairly without unnecessary escalation. The experience had even inspired Jake to share his story with others facing similar challenges. He began writing a blog detailing his journey, a resource for property owners, navigating the sometimes murky waters of homeowner associations and legal rights. His goal was to empower others with knowledge, helping them protect their own sanctuaries. Jake understood now that owning property, especially near active communities, meant more than enjoying the land, meant being vigilant and proactive. But he also knew that the real victory was reclaiming the simple joy of his lake cabin. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting fiery hues across the sky, Jake sat quietly on his porch. The gentle lap of water against the shore, the call of distant birds, and the soft rustle of leaves reminded him why this place mattered. It was more than just a cabin. It was his home, and now, finally, it was his peace.